let me ask Daniel Levy to please come up and offer the Israeli perspective, if you would. Thank you, Daniel.
I might disappoint you on that. How about if I disappoint you on giving the Israeli perspective, but I make you happy in the timing? I think that's probably a deal you'd accept. Okay. Thank you, Toni, and the Middle East Institute. What I've been asked to do is look at the Israeli domestic realities and then put that into the bigger picture, and I'll try and do that for you without telling you too much that you know already, and without intensifying the suspense that we were left in by Khalil at the end of his tremendous tour de force there. The divided nature of the Israeli polity, the fact that Israel is into its 32nd, I believe it is, government now, and we're only into our 62nd year of existence and independence, is probably well known to most of this audience. The first point I'd like to make is to try and give you an appreciation of how structural I think that has become. I would argue that a constellation of circumstances in the mid-90s led to a situation where we have a deeply dysfunctional Israeli polity. There were things going on in Israeli society, the wave of immigration from the former Soviet Union, the increasing national identity and ability to articulate a different vision being assumed by the Palestinian Arab community inside Israel, the increasing rise of Sephardi Orthodoxism. And when that was married to a change in Israel's electoral system, I think we basically broke Israel as a functioning parliamentary democracy. Israel moved to a system of 2 ballots. We did it in 1999. Sorry, 96, and then again in 99. And that encouraged this proliferation of small parties, and I don't think we've ever managed to put that back in the bottle again. So today, the Israeli polity that you are dealing with is a parliamentary democracy which does not have an executive branch, as you have here. Every day, the Israeli prime minister is dependent on a majority of 61 in the 120-member Knesset. It's not that you're elected for 4 years and you can plan those 4 years, and maybe you have to worry about a filibuster-proof 60 Senate majority, and maybe you have to worry about blue dog Democrats. No. In Israel's 120-member Knesset, there are 12 different parties represented. The largest single party, which is not the governing party, is less than a quarter of the seats. Less than half of Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition is drawn from his own party, and the 27 that are from his own party are far from guaranteed as supporters of any party line that he might want to define. Governmental reform has become a major issue in Israel against that backdrop. And so the first point I'd make is you don't have a 4-year planning horizon as an Israeli prime minister. If it's a 4-month or a 4-week planning horizon, then luxury is entering your governmental management equation. What the Vinograd report into the Lebanon War of 2006, which you'll remember there was a committee established afterwards, the Vinograd Committee, one of the things they found is what a lack of interagency process we have in Israel. That you don't have strong institutions bringing long-term strategic planning to the governmental table. The only agency in the Israeli system that has that capacity is the IDF, is the Israeli Defense Forces. And serious military people will be the first ones to tell you that if they're the only body in a decision-making structure that's bringing long-term planning to the table, you're going to have a deeply imbalanced decision-making process. The problem is, because you can have an Italian political reality, and people basically say, politics isn't going to deliver for me, I'm going to get on with my own life, hopefully politics won't too much get in the way. But an Italian political reality, combined with a Middle Eastern geostrategic reality, is not a recipe for a happy outcome. Now, obviously, this isn't to say that Israel doesn't have its own responsibilities, isn't responsible for its own situation, etc. But I think it poses a serious question if one is imagining a process where the drive to resolve this process is going to come from the parties themselves, and in this respect, from the Israeli political system. And that poses real challenges to an American administration which defines this, resolving this conflict in its own national security interests. By the way, of course, the particular coalition that Prime Minister Netanyahu has chosen was his own decision. That was his choice. It was his choice not to have Kadima in the coalition. Kadima, led by Tzipi Livni, set two benchmarks essentially. One was a statement of seriousness regarding the peace process. The other was a rotation. In other words, Tzipi would be prime minister part of the time. The extent to which Livni was committed to the rotation was never put to the test because Netanyahu never gave a satisfactory answer on the first question of a serious peace process. Beyond that, I'd say there are three main challenges, domestic politically speaking. One is that the ideological constituency represented by the settlers is not something to be taken lightly. There are 500,000 Israelis living over the Green Line. 300,000 of those are in the West Bank. That begins to take on the dimensions of a serious constituency, certainly when one bears in mind their supporters from inside the Green Line. Not all of the settlers, of course, are ideologically predisposed to a greater Israel or to a theological vision. But I would argue that any Israeli prime minister serious about deoccupation and two states does have good reason to lie awake at night worried about a political showdown with the settlers and their supporters. The second is what I would call a securocrat mentality that I believe is now pervasive in the Israeli establishment after so many years of peace processing. And that securocrat mentality is one that has got used to the luxury of looking at the territories as Israel's outer envelope of security and has got used to the luxury of Israeli freedom of operation in those territories, even in the context, by the way, of withdrawing from Gaza. That applies still, I'd say, basically to Gaza and to the West Bank. And it's going to be difficult to wean the security establishment and the elites that take their lead from the security establishment off of that. But it does mean that, in fact, when Prime Minister Netanyahu puts security arrangements front and center of his arguments, as he did at Bar Ilan, as he did again yesterday at the CJF General Assembly here in Washington, that matters. I think there are answers to that, which may actually make this easier to do, but this is saying something about how the Israeli system looks at this. And the third thing I'd say is, to my mind, the system of incentives and disincentives in the short term is always stacked in favor of the disincentives, is always stacked against the incentives for doing anything now. Kadima leaders, and even occasionally now Prime Minister Netanyahu and Rahm Emanuel today at that same conference in his speech, can come with the argument that if in the long term, if in the future, one wants a state that is a national home to the Jewish people, but still is a democracy, that Israel cannot continue with the control of the Palestinians and needs a two-state solution, one can make that argument. But what does it translate into tomorrow? What does it translate into when one has to confront one's coalition, maintain one's 61 votes? Are the ministers Benjamin Begin and Bughi Ya'alon going to stay in the government or not? And as long as they're happy in the government, if you want to look for one indicator of whether we're ever moving seriously in a peace effort, as soon as those two make noises that they're leaving the government, you can start to think that we're being serious. But when you look at what's happening tomorrow, keeping your coalition together, etc., the system tends to be stacked against taking the big move.